Please welcome the President and CEO of Spirt Airlines, Ted Christie, in conversation with CNBC airline reporter Leslie Josephs.
We have with us Ted Christie, CEO of Spirt Airlines. Ted, welcome.
Thanks
for being here. You appear to be at the Spirt Airlines music studio. Can you tell us where you
side business? The Christie household music studio. That's right. Yeah.
God, that's a lot of time for music, I think, in the quarantine.
Yeah, plenty of that. That's been the one of the few positives, I would guess. But I've been able to take advantage of a few of the toys.
You could write your new jingle. Well, we're a few weeks away from Thanksgiving. Why don't you just give us a sense of where demand is going? I mean, this has been just a huge year, a difficult year, I think, for all airlines just because of the pandemic. Where are things going now?
I mean, I think that's a good lead in and an understatement. It's been certainly a challenging year for all of us, for the industry, for the world, for that matter. But also when it just comes down to the practicality of forecasting demand, it's a challenge when there are so many macro issues that can influence that. We had our earnings call just a few weeks ago. And at that time, we knew we were heading into a few things like seasonally disruptive periods, like an election cycle. Believe it or not, the Halloween week. We knew that coronavirus cases had been on the rise nationwide for the better part of a couple of weeks, and so that was beginning to factor into our view of the world. And then, we also had a tropical storm, approach and nearly hit the peninsula of Florida. As you know, we're largely a Florida airline. Almost half of our capacity is in Florida, so that can always have an impact as well. So it's, we thought about all that as we were thinking of it, and generally seeing throughout the course of the month of October and into the peak holiday season, seeing encouraging trends. People starting to get more comfort around booking. And you can see that in the window that they book their activity was stretching out and that sort of thing. And so we amongst other airlines have increased capacity heading into the holiday season, be it both Thanksgiving and the Christmas New Year's period, in anticipation of continuing to recover out of the depths of earlier this year. I still think that's a good trend line. But clearly there's some disturbing trends on the horizon with coronavirus cases continuing to go up right now throughout the country, and more discussion at state and local governments about possible restrictions around activity. Those kind of things obviously can be destimulative if they materialize, and that sort of thing. Thus far, since the summer, I would describe the American consumer as a little bit more resilient. So it feels like they built some incremental confidence, but it doesn't mean that it can't be shaken or pushed off track if, for whatever reason, either the government tells them that they should feel differently or they start to interpret the numbers that way.
Right. Are you seeing, because of the spike in cases, and then maybe some travel restrictions or recommendations for quarantines, or even things that aren't open, restaurants shutting down again in certain locations, and other activities that normally people would go do when they arrive at their destination, or those aren't available? Are you seeing any drop off in demand, and which geographies, if so?
Yeah, given how late, as I said earlier, our earnings call was, we were the last ones to report, so we were able to digest some of that information in our view. If anything has changed since then, I would say it's too early to say for sure, based on what we said before. So I think we'll work our way through the peak, which we head into next week, the Thanksgiving travel week, and that'll give us a good indicator about are any of these things that we just referenced, be it the nationwide data with regard to coronavirus cases or the government's activity around that, or either one of those things having a pronounced impact. We'll certainly get a better flavor for that over the next week.
Okay, so Spirit isn't registering any increase in cancellations around Thanksgiving for that travel, or maybe even Christmas bookings that were recently made?
Yeah, again, because the it's sort of the good news, bad news. The booking window is much more compressed post the coronavirus issue than it was at any time last year or any time in our history. So I keep saying it's too early to say. It is still a developing situation. So I don't know that I can definitively guide you one way or the other or produce any different information than what we've already talked about.
Okay. And how do you look at Spirit Airlines, their path towards profitability? When do you expect that to be, and how are you expecting to get there?
So the best way, by the way, it starts with capacity. The airline, any airline, but an airline business is a levered business at the operational level, which means that we have a notable amount of fixed expense, right? And it depends on the airline how much of your total cost structure is fixed and how much is variable. But regardless of the airline, we all have a tremendous amount of fixed expense in the form of labor and assets, airplanes. And so in order for any business built like that has a fixed base, you have to operate a considerable amount of your capacity in order to get over the line, right? The simplest way to think about it is that at full capacity, and at more optimal profit times, so over the last 5 years or so, you could just look at EBITDA as a proxy for cash generation at any airline, and that percent is how much they could withstand in reduction of revenue, capacity, yield, whatever you might be. And so it's our view that the best way to get our airline back moving towards profitability is get more and more capacity through the system. Obviously, that capacity has to be accretive, meaning there has to be people on board. And we have been able to do that thus far. So our system for the fourth quarter, our year-over-year capacity will be down about 25%, which is more than it has been in each quarter prior, and more than most of the industry. And so the reason for that is low-cost leisure traffic is what's back or what's coming back. And so starting to roll out more and more of that capacity with good accretion, some more attachment from the consumer, will get us closer and closer to cash break even, and then we start managing our way down the profit and loss statement through the margins. You're getting through EBITDA, then you're going through operating margin, then into pre-tax profitability, and then you're on your way. And that will be a mix of cost management and yield management or revenue management.
Sorry to interrupt you, but you bring up cash burn, and you were ahead of expectations for cash burn in the last quarter. What are your expectations for the fourth quarter and going into the winter season? A lot of people looking for sun, but maybe they're worried about coronavirus still.
Yeah. Well, what we said on our call was two things. One is we anticipate our cash burn per day, as it's been measured since the pandemic, would improve again modestly in the fourth quarter. So going from, we reported about $2.4 million a day, we got it to around $2 million a day for the fourth quarter. And we also, the second thing we said is, we're now in the window of the recovery where we think it's more appropriate to start talking about EBITDA rather than just this cash burn metric, because EBITDA represents the actual operating throughput of the business. It doesn't take into account timing of payments and timing of receipts, which is more of a cash burn look. And our reason for that is we feel like we've moved out of that window where cash burn is relevant. We've got adequate liquidity. We've seen a recovery in the business. Now it's time to start managing the operating cash flows of the business. And I think we're starting to move our way through. But that's the guidance we gave. Okay.
And then you also bring up low cost leisure travel, which is your bread and butter, and it's now everybody's bread and butter. How do you think about that when you're planning? Is Spirit Airlines the aggressor, or playing defense? I mean, they're even going after your home turf in Florida. How do you think about all this competition?
Yeah, I don't know if we would call ourselves aggressor or defense. I think what we are is a stimulator. And that hasn't changed pre and post pandemic. We come into markets with low fares, and for that reason, more people travel. That's true today too. That is not different. And so in this environment, what you just described we believe is largely true, that guest, that customer, the low fare leisure customer, is the vast majority of the market today. And so the good news is that's always been our market. So what
Right.
we're doing is at our fare structure and at our cost structure, we're behaving largely the same way we always have, which is to stimulate those people back to the market and carry them. Unfortunately, for other airlines who have relied on a mix of leisure customers and higher yielding leisure and higher yielding corporate, to the extent that those higher yielding travelers are gone, they're having to dip down further into the low fare bucket than they used to before, on average, right? And so to the extent that that's all stimulative and that more people are traveling because more low fares are out there, then that's good for volume, and probably neutral to positive for us. But I think it probably wouldn't be great to have a high cost business and carrying a lot of it.
Is there any more costs to cut at Spirit? Or
we never give up on that exercise. That's a perpetual part of our DNA.
What's left?
We are the lowest cost provider in the United States, and we intend to retain that mantle. And our expectation is that once we collectively emerge from the crisis and we start to recover, we will widen our cost advantage. Because we believe that we'll be able to better address the marketplace with capacity than some of our peers, and that will be an advantage of ours. How that math works out yet remains to be seen, but that's our current view of the world. So yes, we're always pursuing efficiencies. By cutting cost, we're really not saying we're removing benefit or removing expertise or that sort of thing from the business. What we're doing is introducing productivity. And the largest vehicle with that is technological deployment, mostly at high touch areas like the airport, where we have a lot of fixed real estate and a lot of fixed overhead that we think can be automated. And that's where we get a lot of benefit.
Does the rising cost of maybe adding flights now, because we are seeing some airlines get a little bit more aggressive. I mean, Southwest, of course, going into O'Hare, and some other announcements that they've had lately, United coming in with these point-to-point flights into Florida. I mean, is that part of Spirit's strategy going into 2021? I mean, do you want to add some new destinations and add capacity in markets that maybe have more competition now because they are doing well relative to international?
Yeah, so we've always had a mix of new markets and incremental flying on existing markets. We also, when we say new market, it could mean either a new route between two cities that we already serve, or just a new dot on the map, right? Mm-hmm. And I think that our opportunity set is still in that same window. For example, this week we inaugurated service to John Wayne Orange County Airport, which was a new airport for us. And today we had our first flight to Bucaramanga, Colombia, and tomorrow we launch Barranquilla, Colombia. So 3 new markets for us over the last week. So I can tell you that there's a few more dots, right? There's also going to be an opportunity to add new routes between cities we already serve going forward. And I think it would be a mix of all that. As it relates specifically to the impact of the crisis and the opportunity set that we see, I think there will be opportunities to fly into places that we've always wanted to be, but we've found have been marginally restricted, either because they haven't had access from a slot or a slot perspective, or perhaps gate assets available. And I think that that's a possibility that we may be able to find some of that.
Any examples?
Well, Orange County is the perfect example. That's a slot-restricted airport, and we were able to get slots because other airlines declined, right? So that's a perfect example of one. There are only 3 primary slot-restricted airports in the country today. That's LaGuardia, JFK, and Reagan National. But there are plenty of airports that have asset restrictions because of availability of gates.
Okay. And you brought up a few airports in Colombia. Just if you could quickly tell us what the appetite is now, VFR, or is it more vacation that's going to some of these northern Indian markets that you've mentioned, Northern South America?
Yeah, the 2 new ones I would describe more as traditional visiting friends and relatives type markets in Colombia, but we serve a mix of Latin American, Caribbean destinations that are both leisure destinations and visiting friends and relatives destinations. And that's why we love our international footprint, because it is that good mix. You've got traditional beach destinations like St. Thomas and Cancun, and at the same time, we serve places like Honduras and Haiti and Nicaragua, which tend to be much more visiting their friends and relatives between the points. And so it's a good mix.
What's the demand been like to those traditionally VFR markets?
Well, as they've opened up, because throughout the course of the pandemic, a lot of those markets closed to U.S. inbound travelers, but they've started and have been consistently opening up their borders, and we've seen good demand for that visiting friends and relatives VFR traffic, because that tends to be when you hear people describe pent up demand, that tends to be the easiest to be pent up, right? Because you haven't seen your family for a prolonged period of time, and so it's easy to say I'm going to jump at that opportunity. So we've had good, successful relaunches of the places where we've been, and they've been good markets for us.
Okay, what's your most popular destination right now, if there is one, or region?
Well, we're biggest today where we've always been biggest, which is Fort Lauderdale, Florida, Las Vegas, Orlando. Those are our primary leisure destinations and origin markets in the United States. And so measured in departures or capacity, those are our biggest markets and always have.
Okay. And just looking at the pandemic in general, what do you think the lasting changes are going to be for aviation? Like, what does Spirit Airlines look like in a year or 2 years? Are the passengers still in masks? Are there ticket agents in person at the airport?
I think we've learned a lot about a few things with regard to, as we've navigated this pandemic. Clearly, there's visible signs of that with facial coverings on board the airplane, barriers at the airport, talking to people. You see those at retail establishments too. Cleaning procedures on board the aircraft, different approaches to flexibility for people buying tickets and whether or not they can use them at later dates. Airlines have kind of segmented themselves somewhat in that regard too. So I think there have been real changes that we've digested as an industry that we're going to use some of those going forward. I can't predict perfectly whether or not, for example, facial coverings will be here 2 years from now. I'm not sure. The optimistic, I guess, way to look at it is if we truly have an effective vaccine and we're able to rid the virus or get rid of the virus largely, then maybe perhaps that starts to lessen in need and requirement. But it could be that this becomes more natural for the traveler too. So I'm not sure, but I would tell you that we specifically, so taking it away from the broader industry and just talking about us, we've learned a lot about managing our capacity and tactically managing our capacity close in. Those learnings will be applied even in a growth or a more robust economic environment.
Close in being like you could add some flights within a week or two? Like how close?
Much more tactical close in, management of the profit and loss of those different markets close in, and the way that our network is designed, being able to almost Lego block it in and out much more effectively. Our network team, our scheduling team, and the operations team working in conjunction with them have come up with new ways to think about that before weren't as necessary, right? I mean, we were just doing our thing, and so. But I think those are positive learnings that will apply.
When do you see Spirit Airlines being able to hire again and add employees?
Yeah, so at a more consistent pace, because as we head into the holiday peak periods, we've had to add a few people at a few airports because things had drawn down so much that we're batting back. But I think when we think about our growth cycle, that's really what you're talking about, is when will we resume growing again? And our current view of the world, our base case, is that by the summer of next year, our capacity will look a lot like it did in 2019. And then we start growing off of that. And so if we're right, first of all, which is big if we're right about our base case, we would expect that we're starting to incrementally add aircraft and people and destinations and all that stuff the second half of next year.
Okay. Are you ruling out any further headcount reduction through voluntary or involuntary means?
So right now, we've tackled that issue in close coordination with our partners at our various unions and with the work groups that are not represented. We were able to structure voluntary programs and avoid furloughs at all of those in all of those areas. And we had a modest reduction in force of management that we have already executed to. And so for now, we've established that as our baseline, and we expect that we're done. But if things obviously change, either hopefully for the positive, it could be that we're calling voluntary people back sooner than or asking them to come back sooner. Or if it gets worse, then we have to reevaluate, right?
Okay. In terms of cases and bookings and
all of that. Yeah, it's really demand.
Okay. Might have to leave it here in a second, but just one closing thing. I mean, getting ready for a change of administration, what do you most wish the Biden administration would change or address in aviation?
Well, one thing that's important to Spirit is access. I mentioned it earlier. We're a growth airline, and by that, we're a growth engine. And we think it's important that for the economy, there's been plenty of studies done on the power of aviation as a multiplier effect in the economic throughput of the country. And we believe we can contribute that as long as we're gaining access to the right places where we need to be. And I think the administration can help us. Any administration can help us with continuing to pursue that growth strategy. So I'm hopeful there will be some active listening and some favorable ears there.
Okay, sounds good. Ted, thank you so much for your time.
Yeah, it's good to see you, Leslie. Thanks.
Appreciate it. Take care. Happy Thanksgiving.
You too. Bye-bye.